Peace, family. I just wanted to come to you and talk about the execution and the controversy surrounding it that took place in Oklahoma. A brother that was executed, it said that he lived after he was given a lethal injection for approximately 43 horrific minutes. Now many, after looking at the case, they're investigating their standards in that particular state as far as capital punishment goes, and how lethal injection is administered and how the whole process is carried out. Many people are questioning the legitimacy of such a system and whether or not it should be practiced. Now there are a plethora of reasons. I'm going to talk about a few why it shouldn't be practiced, and then I'm going to touch upon what the Bible has to say as far as capital punishment. Just some reasons I want to read to you pertaining to capital punishment, which is basically the killing of someone when they commit a crime. For example, if someone murders someone, then in states in which capital punishment is legal, that person could be killed, okay, as a punishment instead of in prison for life or 20 years or whatever. So just some reasons, some logical reasons as to what you think are logical reasons as to why it shouldn't be done. Number one, executions cost way more money than keeping somebody in prison. Okay, in a 2011 study, they found that in California they had spent $4 billion, that's with a B, $4 billion since 1978. Okay? And that death penalty trials are 20 times more expensive than trials seeking a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. Okay, so that's a lot of money. California currently spends $184 million on the death penalty each year. All right. Another reason, there is little evidence that capital punishment in this society there's little evidence that it actually deters crime. Okay? One thing, we know that in history of the United States, we know for a fact that innocent people have been killed. We're talking a lot of people that have been killed through capital punishment who were innocent of the crime. So with such a system, how is it legitimate to kill someone when there's this possibility of them being innocent? You have all kind of cases where people are innocent spending decades in prison. You look at what's going on with the Innocence Project and how people are being found innocent, and you look at the torture of the Chicago Police Department, what they were doing to young brothers and forcing confessions out of them when they were innocent. All this has gone on for quite some time, and that leads me to the next point: the inherent racism of the U.S. justice system. The United States justice system is inherently racist. Racist to its core. I just want to read something to you. The race of the victim plays an important part in who lives or who dies. Okay? The race of the victim and the race of the defendant in capital cases are major factors in determining who is sentenced to die in this country. In 1990, a report, this is, by the way, this is from deathpenalty.org, okay? In 1990, this whole article that I'm reading, in 1990, a report from the General Accounting Office concluded that in 82% of the studies reviewed, race of the victim was found to influence the likelihood of being charged with capital murder or receiving the death penalty. I.e., those who murdered whites were more likely to be sentenced to death than those who murdered blacks. Now, when you think about it, it's quite logical because we know that white life is valued more than black life in the U.S. society. I mean, we know that. We know that. We know that this is a country that was based on, the foundation of it was genocide against the indigenous and slavery of our people. So you know that racism, you can't do that without racism. You simply cannot do it without racism. We know that when you look at incarceration in general, this country incarcerates more of its citizens than any other country. And we know that even though black people make up roughly 13 to 14% of the population, they are the majority almost the majority in prison. And many of these convictions and many who are incarcerated, these are not for violent crimes. These are for drug offenses. But we know, what do we know about drugs? We know that blacks, whites, and Latinos use and sell drugs at the same rate. Some estimate that whites sell and use drugs more. But who is incarcerated? Those who are incarcerated are people of color. Why? Because our neighborhoods are policed more, and we are incarcerated largely because it is a way to control populations who are considered to be unemployable or no longer useful to capitalism, right? So that's why you see many of our young men in particular locked up. Okay, so you look at the inherent racism of the system, and that should let you know that just right there alone that it's not a legitimate system. The death penalty is applied at random, right? Politics, quality of legal counsel, and the jurisdiction where a crime is committed are more often the determining factors in a death penalty case than the facts of the crime itself. The death penalty is a lethal lottery. Of the 22,000 homicides committed every year, approximately 100 people or less are sentenced to death. All right. So all these factors. Another thing about capital punishment. Just want to read a little bit more. Bad lawyers are a persistent problem in capital cases. It's just like anything else. When you have good counsel, when you have a good legal team or a good lawyer, you can get off. Or you can have a sentence reduced. But people who are poor and impoverished, not from the right socioeconomic class, those are the ones who are more likely to be killed. Even though the crime may not be more heinous, you see. So those are just some things about the death penalty. Now I want to move to the Bible, because we live in a country that has capital punishment in a lot of states. Okay, so let's see what the Bible has to say, because we know that capital punishment was administered in the Bible, particularly when you read in the Old Testament. Right? Let's read some. I just want to read this about adultery. Okay, so this is Leviticus, the 20th chapter. And verse 10. Leviticus 20 and verse 10. It reads, "And the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death." And back in those times, they would stone you. Now you see, you can read instances of a man who violated the Sabbath day and was stoned. Okay, so this was done. And God is the one. Moses didn't come up with this. God put this law into motion. Now let's see what the Messiah, the Christ, and who you really understand it is the one who's given the law to Moses here. Let's find out what he says when he was manifested in the flesh and some brought one caught in adultery. Remember now, in this instance, the adulterer, who was the man, and the adulteress, the woman, were both to be stoned. Let's go to John. Let's go to the Gospel according to John. I'll be brief. John, chapter 8 and verse 3. So it says, "And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman," talking about Christ, "brought unto him a woman taken in adultery, caught in the very act. And when they had set her in the midst," so they bring this woman out in the middle of everybody. She's been caught in adultery. "They say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned, but what sayest thou?" Now we just read what was written in Leviticus about the adulterer and adulteress being stoned. And so these come tempting Jesus, tempting Christ, asking them, "What say you?" The law says this. This they said, tempting him that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground as though he heard them not. So he basically ignored them. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. So after he said, basically, he was without sin, let him cast the first stone, then he goes back to the ground and starts writing on the ground again. Now, why does he do this? Well, let's keep reading. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last, and Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. Now, those who were ready to stone this woman, they dropped their rocks, they dropped their stones, and they walked off, convicted in their very conscience. Why? Because they were hypocrites. And this is unjust administration of punishment. Why? Because it said in the law, the adulterer and the adulteress were supposed to be stoned. Why are you bringing only the woman? You said she was caught in the very act. See? They were convicted in their very conscience even when they... So that was wrong. That was wrong. They're not even... So they're talking about the law, but they're not even following the law accurately or accordingly. Then the next thing, when they looked at their own selves and the sin that they had committed, they couldn't throw a stone because they had, just like her, broken the law of God, had transgressed his law, statutes, and commandments, because that's what sin is. 1 John 3 and 4 tells us, He who sinned and transgressed the law, for sin is the transgression of the law, or the breaking of the law of God. And they had done it, so how are you righteous enough to kill somebody? This is the same thing when you look at capital punishment. How can you, in a society, in a country where moral relativism is the norm, how can you be the one to push the button for lethal injection, or administer that lethal injection, or push the button to electrocute someone? How can you hang somebody with a noose? How can you put somebody in front of a firing squad because you have sinned? See, the Lord took that out of the hands of man. Why? Because at this point, man was simply not righteous enough. The nation Israel was not righteous enough to carry out capital punishment. And today, this country, people in it, are surely, even though it's a country that they claim is based on the law of God, has on the money, in God we trust. But we know for a fact, when you read the book and you look at what's going on in this country, it has, since its inception, it has nothing to do with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God of this world, maybe, for sure, but not the true and living God. So this is why all these other reasons are definitely, that I read earlier, prior to reading the scriptures, are logical reasons as to why capital punishment should simply not be administered or carried out. But when you really try to find wisdom on things and how to look at things, I personally look at the scripture and it gives us insight. So today, how can an adulterer kill somebody for murder? How can a liar kill somebody for murder? You see, how can someone who's constantly sinning kill somebody for sin? I want to read further. It says in John 8 and verse 10, after they had left and been convicted in their very conscience, when Jesus had lifted up himself and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, which is something that all people need to take heed to, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. You see, go and sin no more. So that's what I say to all those proponents of capital punishment, right? Drop your stones and go and sin no more.